No one noticed anything was wrong at first. The neighborhood was quiet in the way most residential streets are during the middle of a weekday afternoon. Cars parked unevenly along the curb, curtains half drawn, the distant hum of traffic bleeding in from somewhere beyond the trees. It was the kind of place where children rode bicycles in small circles and came home when they were hungry, not because they were afraid. That was why, when the two brothers didn't return, no one panicked. At least not immediately. The older boy was 8 years old, careful, observant, the type who liked to explain rules to other children even when no one asked. His younger brother, just 5, followed him everywhere, copying his words, his steps, his courage. That afternoon in 2012, they left their home together, dressed plainly. One wore a blue shirt. The other wore green. They told their caregiver they would be nearby. They never came back. Before we uncover what happened in today's unsettling story, please support the channel, like this video, leave a comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another true crime story like this. By early evening, concern began to replace patience. Calls were made. Doors were knocked on. Neighbors checked yards, garages, the narrow spaces between fences where children sometimes hid during games. Someone suggested the boys might have wandered farther than usual. Someone else mentioned the wooded stretch beyond the edge of the neighborhood, an area everyone knew existed but rarely visited. When the sun went down and the boys were still missing, panic arrived all at once. Police lights cut through the darkness. Search dogs were brought in. Volunteers formed loose lines, sweeping flashlights across ditches, bushes, abandoned lots. Names were shouted into the night until voices grew hoarse. Nothing answered back. By morning, the case had transformed from a local emergency into something far heavier. Officers went door to door. Detectives asked the same questions repeatedly, hoping inconsistencies would surface. Did anyone see the boys after they left? Did anyone notice a vehicle idling too long? A stranger? A sound that didn't belong? There were no clear answers. What investigators did know was unsettling in its simplicity. 2 children had vanished within a narrow window of time, in a familiar area, without leaving behind a single confirmed trace. Search efforts intensified. The surrounding land was combed repeatedly. Creeks were dragged. Old structures were inspected. Helicopters scanned from above, their low thrum echoing across fields and rooftops. Tips flooded in, some earnest, others cruelly hopeful, but none led anywhere solid. Then came the detail that would haunt the case. Tracking dogs picked up a scent not far from where the boys were last believed to have been seen. It wasn't strong, and it didn't last long. The trail moved toward an overgrown access road on the outskirts of the area, a place rarely used, partially blocked by fallen debris and weeds. And then the scent stopped. Not faded. Not drifted. Stopped. To seasoned handlers, it suggested only one thing: the boys had entered a vehicle. From that moment on, the investigation shifted. Detectives began operating under the assumption that someone else had been involved. Someone who knew how to move unnoticed. Someone who understood timing. Someone who had taken advantage of how ordinary the afternoon had seemed. Despite this, no witnesses could place the boys getting into a car. No security cameras captured anything useful. No license plate numbers surfaced. It was as if the brothers had been erased mid-step. Weeks turned into months. Posters faded on telephone poles. Media coverage slowed, then reignited, then slowed again. Each anniversary reopened wounds that never truly healed. The boys' family marked time not by holidays or seasons, but by absence. How old the children would be now, what grades they should be in, how tall they might have grown. Investigators pursued every angle. Known offenders were questioned. Tips were cross-checked. Behavioral analysts were consulted. Theories multiplied: opportunistic abduction, targeted crime, mistaken identity. None of them could be proven. Years passed. The case grew cold in the way only missing children cases can, never closed, never forgotten, simply waiting. Files thickened with unanswered questions. Evidence was preserved, reviewed, boxed, and reboxed. Every so often, something would spark renewed interest: a tip, a supposed sighting, a rumor from someone who waited years to speak. Each time, hope rose. Each time, it fell again. By 2022, a decade had passed. The brothers would have been teenagers by then. For some, the idea that they could still be alive was the only thing that made the waiting bearable. For others, it was the uncertainty itself that hurt the most, not knowing whether to grieve or to hope. That same year, miles away from where the boys disappeared, a man set out alone for a short camping trip. He wasn't looking for answers. He wasn't searching for anything at all. An experienced camper, he preferred isolated places, areas that didn't appear on popular trail maps, locations most people avoided because they were inconvenient or forgotten. That weekend, he chose a patch of land known mostly to locals and rarely maintained. It had once served a purpose long ago, but now it existed in a kind of quiet neglect. On his second day there, while exploring beyond his campsite, he noticed something unusual near the edge of an abandoned clearing. At first, he thought it was trash. Clothes were not uncommon in places like this: discarded jackets, torn fabric, remnants of people passing through. But these were different. Partially buried beneath leaves and dirt were two small shirts, tangled together as if deliberately placed. One was blue. The other was green. They were stiff with age, stained dark with soil, turned roughly inside out in places. Whatever had happened to them had not been accidental. The fabric bore signs of forced twisting, pulling, intentional handling. The camper felt an immediate sense of unease. He didn't touch them. Instead, he stepped back, heart pounding, trying to convince himself there was a reasonable explanation. But something about the size of the clothing, the way they were positioned, and the isolation of the area told him otherwise. He took photographs. Then he made a call. Within hours, law enforcement arrived. The clearing was cordoned off. Evidence markers were placed carefully around the shirts. Forensic teams began working the scene with a level of seriousness that made one thing very clear. This wasn't just lost clothing. And it wasn't random. As news of the discovery traveled through investigative channels, one long-dormant case was quietly reopened. 2 boys. Gone for 10 years. And now, finally, something had surfaced. But the shirts were only the beginning. And what investigators would soon realize was far more disturbing than the disappearance itself. The clearing where the shirts were found did not appear on any modern maps. That detail alone troubled investigators. The land sat beyond maintained trails, accessible only by following a narrow, overgrown route that branched off from an old service road. It was not a place someone would stumble into by accident. Reaching it required intention, knowledge of the area, or time spent exploring places most people never bothered to visit. Forensic teams worked carefully. The shirts were photographed, bagged, and transported under strict chain-of-custody protocols. Soil samples were collected. Leaves were sifted. Every inch of ground surrounding the discovery was searched for additional evidence: footwear impressions, personal items, fibers, anything that could explain how the clothing ended up there. Nothing else was found. No bones. No blood. No signs of a struggle at the site itself. Which meant one thing. The clearing was not the primary crime scene. Back at the lab, The shirts told a quiet but devastating story. They had been worn for a significant amount of time before being removed. Dirt was embedded deep into the fibers, inconsistent with casual loss or disposal. The way the fabric was twisted suggested force, hands gripping tightly, possibly in haste or anger. Most chilling of all, both shirts had been turned partially inside out. Investigators recognized the implication immediately. This was not laundry discarded by chance. This was clothing removed from children. The case file from 2012 was pulled from storage. Within hours, the match was undeniable. The colors, the sizes, the approximate age of the garments. They aligned perfectly with what the brothers were last seen wearing the day they vanished. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone who had ever worked the case. Detectives who had long since moved on were called back in. Retired officers offered to consult. Analysts reopened timelines that had not been touched in years. And once again, the same question loomed over the investigation. Who could have done this, and how had they vanished so completely? Attention quickly turned to the camper. Not as a suspect, but as a key witness. He was brought in for a formal interview. Calm, cooperative, visibly shaken. He explained how he chose camping locations, how he deliberately avoided popular sites, how he often explored surrounding areas out of curiosity and solitude. He described noticing subtle disturbances in the landscape, flattened vegetation, patterns that didn't match natural decay. What led him to the clearing, he said, was a feeling that something wasn't right. Investigators noted this carefully. 10 years earlier, during the original search, resources had been focused closer to residential zones and obvious wilderness paths. This remote pocket of land had never been searched, not because it was ignored, but because no one realized it mattered. The person responsible had known that. As the reopened investigation unfolded, analysts began re-examining old witness statements with fresh eyes. Minor details that once seemed insignificant now felt loaded with possibility. One report stood out. A neighbor had mentioned, casually at the time, a vehicle seen parked near the edge of the area on the afternoon the boys disappeared. It wasn't suspicious enough to raise alarms back then, just a vehicle sitting longer than expected. No one recorded the make or model. No one wrote down a plate number. Another statement described someone asking for directions earlier that week. The memory was vague. The description even vaguer. But the location matched disturbingly well with the route that led toward the clearing. Individually, the details meant nothing. Together, they suggested planning. Behavioral experts were brought in. They reviewed the timeline, the environment, the ages of the victims. Their conclusion was unsettling but consistent. This was not an impulsive act. Whoever took the boys understood how to blend into normalcy. They chose a time when children were expected to be outside. They acted quickly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. The absence of evidence pointed not to luck, but to experience, or at least rehearsal. And then there was the question of the shirts. Why place them there? Why wait years? Investigators theorized several possibilities. The clearing may have served as a temporary stop, an intermediate location used shortly after the abduction. Or the shirts could have been kept elsewhere for years and deliberately planted later, either as a message or a mistake. But one theory troubled detectives more than the others. The shirts may have been placed there recently. Weathering analysis suggested prolonged exposure, but not necessarily 10 full years. The garments could have been moved, stored, then returned to the open. If true, it meant someone had gone back. Someone had revisited the site. That realization shifted the tone of the case. This was no longer just about what happened in 2012. It was about what might still be happening now. Search teams expanded outward from the clearing, mapping potential access points, old roads, and forgotten structures. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Canines returned, this time trained for aged scent detection. Again, the trail was faint. Again, it stopped abruptly. No remains were located. No secondary items surfaced. Public interest surged once the discovery became known. Media outlets framed it as a breakthrough, a turning point. Tips poured in from across the region. People revisited old memories, conversations, gut feelings they had ignored a decade earlier. Most went nowhere. But a pattern began to emerge. Several tips referenced the same general idea. A person who had frequent access to the area, someone familiar enough with remote locations to move undetected, someone whose presence wouldn't have raised suspicion. Yet no name could be confirmed. No arrest followed. The family of the boys was notified quietly, away from cameras. The confirmation that the shirts belonged to their children reopened grief that had never truly closed. Hope, once carefully preserved, now existed alongside dread. Investigators were honest with them. The discovery was significant, but it did not mean closure. As weeks passed, forensic testing continued. Trace elements were analyzed. Fibers were cross-checked against databases. No matches emerged. The shirts yielded no usable DNA profile belonging to anyone other than the boys. Whoever had done this had left nothing behind. By the end of the year, the case sat in a familiar, painful place. More answers than before. Still not enough. The camper returned home, his trip permanently altered by what he had found. He would later admit that he regretted going off-trail that day, not because he wished he hadn't reported it, but because he couldn't stop thinking about how long the shirts had been waiting to be seen. 10 years in silence, and possibly longer still, because somewhere out there, the person responsible had never been identified, never questioned, never stopped being free. And investigators were beginning to fear that the clearing and the shirts were not the end of the story. By early 2023, the investigation had slowed, not from lack of effort, but from lack of evidence. Detectives now faced the same invisible wall they had hit a decade earlier. Every path led to silence. Every theory ended in uncertainty. The shirts had confirmed what everyone feared but never wanted proven. The disappearance of the two brothers had not been an accident, and it had not been spontaneous. Someone had taken them, and that person had planned well. The clearing where the shirts were found became a focal point for deeper analysis. Old aerial photographs were pulled from archives and layered over modern satellite images. What emerged was subtle but troubling. 10 years earlier, the area had looked slightly different. Vegetation had been thinner. A narrow track, barely visible now, once cut through the brush, connecting the clearing to an older, semi-forgotten access route. A route that no longer officially existed. It suggested the clearing had been reachable by vehicle in the past, even if it no longer appeared that way. Whoever had used it likely knew the land well enough to understand how time would erase their movements. Investigators began asking a new question. Had the shirts been placed there to be found? The answer mattered. If the garments had been left shortly after the abduction, then the clearing was part of the original crime. But if they had been placed later, much later, it meant someone returned to the area with intention. Either way, the act was deliberate. Psychological profilers weighed in once more. They noted that removing and retaining clothing was often symbolic. It could represent control, memory, or a desire to revisit the crime without being seen. The partial turning of the shirts inside out hinted at haste or agitation, possibly the moment when the children were separated from something familiar. Or from each other. Another theory began to circulate quietly among investigators, though few were comfortable voicing it aloud. What if the shirts were a reminder? Not for the public, but for the person who left them. A way to mark time. A way to return. As the case gained renewed attention, law enforcement released limited details to the public, careful not to reveal everything. They emphasized the location of the discovery and the timeline, hoping it would jog memories. They asked for information from anyone who had camped, worked, or traveled through the region in the years following 2012. Again, tips poured in. Some were emotional. Some were disturbing. A few described individuals who spoke obsessively about missing children, or who collected news articles about disappearances. Others mentioned people who had suddenly left the area years earlier, cutting ties without explanation. None could be conclusively linked. The frustration was palpable. Then came a detail that changed how investigators viewed the camper's role. During a follow-up interview, he mentioned something he hadn't initially thought important. On the day he found the shirts, he noticed signs that the ground had been disturbed. Not recently, but not long ago either. The soil above the garments was layered unevenly, as if someone had tried to conceal them without much care. That detail had been overshadowed by the shock of the discovery. But now it mattered. Forensic analysis supported his observation. While the shirts themselves showed long-term exposure, the debris covering them appeared to have been rearranged within the last few years. Not weeks, not months, but years. It narrowed the window. Someone had returned to that clearing long after 2012. And that meant the case wasn't just cold. It was active. Detectives revisited known persons of interest, not suspects, but individuals who had lived or worked near the area and later relocated. One name came up repeatedly across unrelated tips, but without evidence, it remained just that, a name. No physical proof. No witnesses willing to testify. No history that could justify a warrant. The legal threshold was never crossed. As months passed, public interest slowly waned again. Headlines faded. The story became another unresolved tragedy competing for attention in an already crowded world. But for the investigators, and for the family, time did not soften the questions. What had the boys seen? Had they known their abductor? Did they understand what was happening? The answers remained locked somewhere unreachable. To this day, no remains have been found. No suspect has been charged. No confession has surfaced. The clearing has been searched multiple times since the discovery, each effort yielding the same result: silence. Nature has reclaimed the space once more, covering footprints that may never be uncovered. The camper has never returned to that place. He has said, in rare interviews, that he sometimes wonders how many years he might have walked past the truth without knowing it. How close answers can exist without revealing themselves. For the family, time has taken on a strange shape. 10 years of not knowing, followed by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, still carries the secret of what happened to 2 small boys in blue and green shirts. The case remains open. Investigators still receive tips. And somewhere out there, a person who understood how to disappear children without being seen continues to live an ordinary life, untouched by suspicion, unburdened by consequence. The shirts are now sealed in evidence storage, preserved not just as fabric, but as proof. Proof that the boys were real. Proof that they were taken. And proof that the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of resurfacing, even if it takes 10 years for someone to stumble upon it by accident. Because in the end, the most unsettling discovery was not what the camper found in the clearing. It was the realization that whoever did this may never be found. and that the disappearance of the two brothers remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases of its time. After everything uncovered in this case, the timing, the location, and the unsettling discovery made a decade later, what do you believe really happened to these two brothers? Was this someone who planned carefully, or someone hiding in plain sight all along? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your theories matter, and sometimes the smallest detail can spark a new perspective. If you found this story compelling, please support the channel by liking the video, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more real-life mysteries like this one. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Some cases never give answers, but remembering them ensures they're never forgotten.